What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, here on a Saturday, we will get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And in the 90s and late 90s into the 2000s, at East 60th Street on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, Scores Gentlemen's Club was one of the greatest gentlemen's clubs in the country. In fact, the owner at one point would say that it made nearly $500,000 a week. The thing is, though, it was controlled by one of the 5 Mafia families. And today, we're going to delve into the very interesting story behind Scores, the man that ran it. And what if I told you one of the people that brought down John Gotti Jr. was a convicted chomo? The story next on Sit Down Shorts. When you discuss Scores Gentlemen's Club, you have to discuss its owner. The founder is this guy, a person called Michael Blutrich. Now, Michael Blutrich was born in December of 1949 and would grow up in South Brooklyn in the vicinity of Avenue Z and East 12th Street in Sheepshead Bay. Now, it was said that at one point in his childhood, Michael Blutrich was actually an actor, a child actor. He would ultimately go to NYU and take his talents to Georgetown Law, where he would become an attorney, graduating in 1974. Now, he'd become an attorney and eventually by the early 80s would become a partner, Blutrich did, in a law firm called Blutrich, Falcone, and Miller, which would be located on Park Avenue in Manhattan. Now, like any good businessman, Michael Blutrich was making good money being an attorney, and he decided to take a lot of his funds and invest it in legitimate business. He had everything from restaurants, the comedy clubs, to even a sporting goods store. And it wasn't just in New York. Blutrich would say that some of his business ventures were in California as well. However, by investing in these businesses, he becomes embroiled in a problem. And in 1990, according to the federal government, Michael Blutrich was involved in fraud as he and business associates began to try to buy an insurance company in Florida. And this will come back to haunt Michael Blutrich down the road when he would become involved in founding Scores, the Gentlemen's Club on East 60th Street. Anyway, he gets this idea, a very lucrative idea, to create a strip club. Why not, right? The Upper East Side, Manhattan, swanky, upscale, celebrities, athletes come in there, spend a bunch of money, and what kind of upkeep is involved with that? You're making big money. You don't got to deal with much. The problem that Michael Blutrich didn't realize is in New York at the time in the early 90s, where Scores was on the Upper East Side was, like every other New York neighborhood, dominated by the Mafia. And people were going to come calling when you did business in that location, whether you were someone who sold chicken or you were a, suit salesman, a mechanic, or you owned a strip club. Those neighborhoods were overrun with mob associates, made men, captains, people that wanted their cut. And everything that was controlled in the strip club meant money. Now, on the Upper East Side, according to Michael Blutrich, he would say that a person he would come to know as Mikey Hop would tell him that that area belonged to the Gambino crime family. And in his case, whenever he wanted to do business, even before opening, he had to get the okay from Mikey Hop and the Gambinos to even operate there. And if he didn't get down or laid down By not complying, he would possibly have to deal with being assaulted. Business wouldn't be able to continue. Maybe the place might be hit with a fire. They would be dealt with. So Michael Blutrich decided that once meeting Mikey Hop, he decided to do what he was told. And the mob came to shake him down. And Michael Blutrich would say over the years that it wasn't just the Gambino family that tried to come shake him down. All sorts of people tried to get in the way of what he was doing, including at one point, Angelo Cheesecake Ergotano would come in and try to shake him down. Ali Boy Persico from the Colombo crime family would try to get him to invest in taking Scores as sort of a franchise and opening a location in Brooklyn. Gentlemen's clubs are big money for the mob. They can come in and bust it out and take money from literally everything. Now, according to Michael Blutrich, he would say that when discussing the strip club venture with Mikey Hop got very excited. Now, Michael Hop was a person called Michael Sergio, and he was a Gambino associate who was not a made man, even though Blutrich claimed that Sergio told him that he had killed people. He never got his button, but he was a very trusted associate and was close to not only Frank Locascio, but his son, Salvatore Torri Locascio. Now, Blutrich would say that initially Mikey Hop loved the idea of the strip club and that he was the skipper. Sergio would make it clear that the space Scores was in, and at one point, Scores was a place called Club A that belonged to the Gambino crime family, and that Blutrich needed to get the okay and register Scores, and that if he didn't do that, he would have issues. And the registering Scores would mean that Stephen and Michael Sergio controlled Blutrich, and whatever he was told to do, he did. Blutrich would decide that registering would make a good idea, so he did it. Now, he would say, Blutrich, that initially the agreed upon amount was $1,000 a week that would be paid to Michael Sergio's son, Stephen Sigmund the Sea Monster Sergio. Now, we have heard that name before. John Gotti talked about it at one point. Sergio was a young guy, very imposing figure, and he would come and collect. Now, the agreement would also state, according to Blutrich, that not only did he have to pay Sergio $1,000 a week, but that the Gambino crime family would also control the coat room in which Stephen Sergio would operate. Sergio down the road, the younger Sergio, would become essentially the general manager of the club. He was always there, and he would ultimately start shaking down DJs and dancers and restaurant staff, and whoever was there, he was shaking down. Blutrich would also state that a member of another family would control the valet parking due to the fact that this was also in an area in which another family had some control over as well, due to the fact that a family owned a pizzeria down the road. And that Blutrich claimed he didn't mind that because he felt that if he had any issues, because he had issues before with criminals trying to get into his business, he could go to the mob and they would deal with it. Ultimately, Scores would become a haven for criminality, but it would also become an extremely successful gentleman's club. Celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio would show up, and regularly on his radio program, shock jock radio host Howard Stern would discuss the club on a regular basis, including even having events there with his staff. It became a very hopping place, and Michael Blutrich would say that he was making a lot of money in the area of $400,000 to $500,000 a week. And he felt like paying the mob was just part of the business. They are probably saying, how does this connect to John Gotti Jr.? Well, according to the federal government, over the course of a 6-year period, the Gambino crime family would extort over $1 million from Scores. And Blutrich was the unwitting issue. Now, problems would ultimately come for Michael Blutrich in and around 1994. And what's weird is it had nothing to do with the Mafia. In 1994, we would find out that Michael Blutrich would plead guilty to disorderly conduct charges stemming from a sexual relationship he allegedly had with a teenage boy who played on a basketball team that Blutrich managed. According to what we know, the boy's mother would say that there were other victims and that they were, quote, scared off by Blutrich because he was a powerful lawyer. Eventually, the woman would say she moved her family away from New York. Now, the boy would allege that at one point, Blutrich took him to Scores, gave him a bracelet and other gifts in return for SA. The allegations would fuel a probe by the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office that uncovered similar charges from other teenage males. Now, investigators, for example, learned that Blutrich would also have a relationship with a 17-year-old boy that he even rented a Staten Island apartment for in 1992. So Blutrich was a scummy, scummy guy. Now, he did have a wife and a child. However, it was openly discussed that Michael Blutrich was openly gay, and he had relationships with men of age and men that were not of age. In fact, boys. However, Blutrich was riding high. He was making a lot of money, and he was doing well. Also, in 1996, Blutrich would be indicted for back in the early 90s trying to pull off a nearly $400 million fraud in an attempt to, as I said, acquire an insurance agency in Florida. The feds knew they had a soft target here, literally and figuratively. So they flipped Michael Blutrich. And over the next year into 1997, Blutrich would claim that he, quote, uncovered all sorts of combos and spoke with dozens of mob associates in over 110 conversations. Now, of the $1 million that the feds allege that over a 6-year period, people like Steven Sergio would take from Michael Blutrich, they would claim that a one lump sum payment in the area of $100,000 was delivered personally to John Jr. Gotti. Understand that in the late 90s, the feds had already busted John Gotti Sr., and the pick of the litter and the man they wanted was John Gotti Jr. And stuff like taking $100,000 because Jr. was greedy and needed money, this was the connection they had to bringing Jr. down and getting him off the street. The other people involved outside of Jr. Gotti included Craig De Palma, the son of Greg De Palma, Mikey Scars DeLeonardo, Steven Sergio, and other members of other families, including Angelo Cheesecake Ergatano. Now, as I said, Michael Blutrich was a scumbag in his own right. Not only was he a chomo, he was now an informant. And down the road, his business would evaporate as well. Scores would ultimately suffer financially due to the thievery from people like Steven Sergio. And Steven Sergio would ultimately tell Anderson Cooper, quote, I'm an entrepreneur. I didn't just take money from Michael Blutrich. I also took a cut from almost everybody who worked at the club. The dancers, the DJ, the busboys, the janitor, everything. He would also say that after making the $1,000 a week that his father initially set at the beginning, down the road, Sergio was making $20,000 a week directly from Michael Blutrich. And the Mafia was taking everything. They would take Scores and turn it from a legit business to nothing. And that Sergio was hired as a, quote, bookkeeper, yet he had no experience, and they were siphoning off tens of thousands of dollars a night. And eventually, Scores went belly up, and it ultimately closed in 2008. Now, Michael Blutrich would also uncover some very interesting conversations over the year that he recorded members and associates of the family. They would discuss everything from payoffs to assaults to murders and even John Gotti Jr.'s ethnicity. They would discuss that another associate, a member called Willie Marshall, someone that John Gotti Jr. regularly lifted weights with, was trying to become a made member of the family that he, quote, couldn't, though, due to the fact that he wasn't fully Italian. And in one conversation, Stephen Sergio discussed that with Michael Blutrich, claiming that there should be a reason that Junior wasn't made too, because he wasn't fully Italian and that his mother was half Jewish. In the end, the hammer would drop on John Gotti Jr. and other members and associates of the Gambino crime family on behalf of Michael Blutrich in 1998. The FBI would drop an indictment around that time alleging that 40 people were involved in a scheme to defraud scores of millions of dollars. It was a 116-count indictment, and people included in that indictment included Lucchese Made Man, Angelo Cheesecake Ergotano, Stephen Sergio alongside his father, Mikey Hop Sergio, Mikey Scars Di Leonardo, Craig and Greg De Palma, and the pick of the litter, John Gotti Jr. Now, John Gotti Jr.'s lawyer, Richie Raybach, would call the indictment, quote, weak and silly, and said the only reason his client was being held was because of his name, adding that Mr. Gotti had never been to Scores. Raybach would say, quote, he has nothing to do with Scores. He absolutely detests those types of places. He thinks they're degrading to women and disgusting. So the normal page out of the Gotti book is, we don't do anything related to that, even though it was common knowledge that Gotti Jr. had accepted $100,000 from the spoils of Scores. So that whole thing was nonsense. In the end, though, the chief informants in this case, including Willie Marshall and Michael Blutrich, destroyed John Gotti Jr. In 1999, John Jr. would plead guilty and down the road was sentenced to 6 years. So the feds had success here. They ultimately were able to take Jr. off the street. Most of his organization was taken off the street, including Stephen Sergio, Michael Sergio, Torrey Lacasio of the Gambino family was off the street. Craig and Greg De Palma. In fact, Craig would ultimately whack himself because of the pressure. Greg De Palma got a long prison sentence and wasn't released until 2003. So this is the goal of the FBI. They do what they have to do to get people off the street. Now, they'll hope to put people in prison for life, but if you can get them off the street for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that's just as good. As I said, Scores would close in 2008 due to financial issues, and we would see this play itself out. A similar situation in Goodfellas, which was released in the early 90s. We remember Sonny Pinto, that guy who owned that Bamboo Lounge. He went to the Lucchese family for help. Paul says, I don't know how to run this. And he says, well, you don't need to. I'll run it. And he starts taking everything. And what does the mob do? They steal. And eventually, you light a match and bust everything out. And that would be something that Stephen Sergio would talk about. Every single thing in that club was being extorted. He was taking from dancers. You know, if they charged $20 to get in, the Gambino crime family would take a few bucks out of the $20. So let's say 100 people were there and the gate that night was $20,000 just in people coming in. They would get 3 or 4 or 5,000. They would take liquor orders. They would take anything that they could steal and get their hands on. The Gambino family was taking. Feds did their job, though, and they were able to get Junior Gotti into prison. Now, down the road, as I said, Michael Blutrich would again be accused of SA involving an 11-year-old boy in 1982, and that would come out several years ago in 2020. Let's not sugarcoat things. Michael Blutrich is a scumbag himself. Now, during the court case in the late 90s, the Gotti team would try to discuss the fact that Blutrich was a convicted chomo. That said, nothing happened, and Blutrich was allowed to operate. Michael Blutrich is now 74 years old and would ultimately write a book about his time as the owner of Scores, called Scores: How I Opened the Hottest Strip Club in New York City, was extorted out of millions by the Gambino family, and became one of the most successful mafia informants in FBI history. He's not wrong. In the end, the FBI viewed Michael Blutrich as extremely successful. In a piece done by 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper would talk to an FBI agent, someone who was involved in this case, called Art Leach. He would say of Michael Blutrich, quote, his info that he provided was, quote, extraordinary, and had been the best that Art Leach had ever seen. Now, you might be asking, why the hell would the federal government do business with people like Michael Blutrich, a person who is a disbarred attorney, a convicted scam artist who stole tens of millions of dollars from an insurance company, a convicted chomo? Why would they do business with someone like that? Well, in the end, they hated John Gotti. They got him in prison. So they wanted his son off the street, and they were willing to do business with him. It's that simple. They'll do business with people that can commit, murders and do all the sorts of things. This is the side of the government that they don't tell you about. As we know, John Gotti Jr. would leave the mob, according to himself, after this sentence and move on with his life. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, this is a very interesting story, and one of which we don't normally talk about: the mob after John Gotti Sr. and some of the things they were doing. Scores was a very successful place and made a lot of money. The owner, though disgusting, the story is interesting. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.